Good evening, folks. How are you? My name is Matthew Warwick, and I am the Education Officer for the Ulster Scots Community Network. Ulster Education Officer is a very grand title, but to be brutally honest, I'm an escaped primary school teacher. I'm not an Ulster Scots expert, I'm an Ulster Scots enthusiast. I come from an area of Mid-Antrim where I was immersed in the Ulster Scots speech of my grandparents from an early age, and now it is my pleasure to make a living out of talking to people about Ulster Scots history, language, culture, diaspora. So I've got a few thoughts to share on Ulster Scots this evening for the patrons of the Linen Hall Library, and can I thank them for the opportunity to speak to you tonight remotely due to the present circumstances. So I have a little presentation here, and it is badged as an introduction to Ulster Scots language. We're going to look at the origins of Ulster Scots and therefore the origin of the Scots language. We're going to look at the etymology of some of the words, the common words and phrases that you would hear right across 9 counties of Ulster today. An awful lot of our everyday speech is tainted with Ulster Scots. There's evidence of the vocabulary used, and often people don't realise that what is Ulster Scots is Ulster Scots. They think it's maybe some inferior form of English or some vocabulary that magically doesn't appear in our reading lists or spelling schemes through the school system. So I've got some images to share with you tonight, and without much further ado, we'll get going. The Mull of Kintyre to Fairhead, the north channel of the Irish Sea. This body of water spans a distance of about 13 miles. And that narrow piece of sea has been a link rather than a barrier for thousands of years, and has seen the constant moving of people, the transmission of languages in both directions, and of surnames, of religious thought, of cultural beliefs, and many other traditions. And I think we often forget how close Scotland and Ireland are together, and our near neighbours across the sea have had a huge influence on this little province of ours. As you can see here, this is a map that's on the wall of the Discover Ulster Scots Centre, where I work out of, down at the Cathedral Quarter. We're closed at the minute, but hopefully once things return to normal, if you haven't paid a visit, please come and see us. You can see here that the main area for commuting across the North Channel was between Galloway here and either the Ards Peninsula across to Donaghadee or Island Magee to Larne. Okay, so you've got about 20 miles here, and this is the direct sort of route back and forward for centuries between Scotland and Ulster. I don't really want to dwell too much on the history of the plantation of Ulster, and indeed the settlement of Randall MacDonald in North Antrim of Lowland Scots prior to the plantation, and the Hamilton Montgomery settlement of 1606. I'm sure you've attended lectures and talks on this in the library before. I just want to focus on the words and phrases. People ask me, is Ulster Scots a language or is it a dialect? Much cleverer people than me, who get paid much more than me, argue that there really isn't a difference between the two, and it's to do with favourable circumstances. For instance, I think it was Max Weinrich, the Yiddish scholar, who once said that a language is a dialect with an army and a navy, sometime around 1945. We tend to think of languages to do with national borders. In France they speak French, in Spain they speak Spanish, etc. But that's not the case. What about Walloon? What about Breton? What about Flemish? What about Basque, Catalan, and many, many more right across Europe? And within these islands as well, you have Cornish, Welsh, there's Manx, Scots Gaelic, Ulster Scots. So I make the claim that Ulster Scots is not just someone speaking bad English with a Ballymena accent. Although I am a Ballymena man who speaks very poor English, I argue that Ulster Scots is a dialect of the Scots language, not of the English language. I have here a little animation that was produced a couple of years ago by the University of Edinburgh, the Linguistics Department. And this little 6-minute animation, you can find it on YouTube, the link is below, details the sort of origins of the Scots language, but it also touches on the origins of all the languages of these islands for the last 2,000 years. And in the sort of 6 minutes, it covers an awful lot of ground and could tell you much more than I could tell you in an hour. So I'm going to play this presentation for you, and we'll maybe discuss some of its content in a little while.
According to Scotland's 2011 census, nearly 2 million people have some Scots language skills. But what is this language we call Scots, and where did it come from? Scots has many different names: Scots, Scotch, Broad Scots, Lowland Scots, even Lallans. It's spoken in the United Kingdom, mainly in the Central Belt and in the northeast of Scotland, but also in Orkney and Shetland, and in Galloway, the Borders, Caithness and other parts. Scots is also spoken in pockets of Ulster. The earliest identifiable languages of the UK are Celtic in origin. We can recognise two types: Dialect, which is the predecessor of Irish Gaelic, Scottish Gaelic and Manx, and Brittonic, whose descendants include Welsh, Cornish and the now extinct Cumbric. When the Romans first arrived in Britain, they encountered several tribes speaking varieties of Brittonic. To the north of Hadrian's Wall were the Picts, whose language was probably a type of Brittonic. We know very little about Pictish, and what we do know comes mainly from place names scattered across the north and east of Scotland, such as place names beginning Pit. After the Romans left, a different Celtic group, this time of Irish origin, made its way into Pictish territories. These raiders, who the Romans called Scotti, settled in the west of Scotland, then part of the kingdom of Dalriada. They were speakers of Old Irish, a Goidelic form of Celtic and the ancestor of present-day Scottish Gaelic. Meantime, in the south, from the middle of the 5th century, following the Romans' departure, waves of Angles, Saxons and Jutes crossed the Channel. Settling first in East Anglia, Kent and the south, these settlers spoke closely related varieties of West Germanic. Within a few generations, these Anglo-Saxons had spread westwards and northwards, reaching the Lothians in the 6th century. Their language, usually termed Old English, had 4 main dialects: Northumbrian, Mercian, Kentish and West Saxon. The 2 northernmost dialects, collectively termed Anglian, were a crucial component in the development of Scots. There was, of course, no Scottish nation in the 6th century. Instead, the Kingdom of Northumbria extended as far north as the Firth of Forth, with the Picts and Gaels holding sway to the north. Next came the Vikings. In the north and east of England, Danes established the Danelaw, a large area under autonomous rule. In northern Scotland and in the northern and western Isles, Norwegians raided and settled. The area of densest Scandinavian presence in England is often referred to by linguists as the Great Scandinavian Belt. Here, the local dialects of English took on many Norse words. Many of these words are now part of Standard English, for example, sky, egg and take, and the pronouns they, them and their. Others have survived as more local terms, for example, Northern lug and lass. Busy with the Vikings further south, the English-speaking Northumbrians were unable to hold their northern border and eventually ceded Lothian to what had become the Gaelic-speaking Kingdom of Alba. But although Scottish Gaelic was by then the dominant language over most of Scotland, Anglian dialects persisted in most of the lowlands. After 1066, England came under Norman rule and French became the language of those in charge. Scotland was never invaded by the Normans, but the Scottish royal court did feel its influence. King David I married Matilda, the great niece of William the Conqueror, and awarded Scottish lands and positions of power to members of the Anglo-Norman elite. The Scottish Normans, who came mainly from the north of England and East Midlands, brought with them large numbers of followers. Many of these followers were English speakers from the old Danelaw area, which meant that their English was heavily influenced by Scandinavian. King David also established royal boroughs, towns with special trading privileges, which became magnets for the nobility and for peasants, traders and craftsfolk. They attracted people from the north of England and from abroad, particularly from the Low Countries. Did you know that Scots has many words adopted from Dutch, including loon and keek? So day-to-day speech in the Scottish boroughs brought together different measures of Gaelic, local Anglian, Scandinavian-influenced English and Dutch. Unfortunately, most surviving documents written in Scotland before the end of the 14th century are written in Latin. This makes it very difficult to trace how the language we know today as Scots emerged from this linguistic morass. What we can say, though, is that the most significant component in the makeup of Scots is Old English, be it the local Anglian dialect of the Lothians or the Scandinavian-influenced English of the Danelaw. Much of the formal, courtly and legal vocabulary of early Scots, by contrast, was adopted from French and Latin. North of the Forth, Gaelic speakers were much more numerous. As a result, the northwards and westwards spread of Scots was slow, especially outside the boroughs. This is one reason why the dialects of those areas differ from those of the central belt. By the 17th century, changes in the relationship between Scotland and England had caused Scots to lose much of its prestige. As a written language, Scots increasingly gave way to English once London became the linguistic centre of gravity. As a spoken language, many Scots found it advantageous to conduct their affairs in English instead. Unable to shake off their Scots pronunciations entirely, however, the variety of English they converged on is now generally referred to as Scottish English. But as a spoken language, and one which is often represented in its various dialects in written works, Scots endures and continues to evolve. It is, without a doubt, a Germanic language at its core, and its closest ties are to English. Still, it carries with it the richness of the many layers of languages and peoples that Scotland has brought together over the ages.
Okay, a very useful tool, I'm sure. It covered a huge amount of time and a huge amount of many centuries in a few minutes, and very, very informative. So here we have two diagrams. So just to reiterate, Ulster Scots, sort of a branch of the West Germanic language tree, if you like, a dialect or an offshoot of the Scots language, which is closely related to English, but also to German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and including smaller languages such as Frisian, etc. Here we see the different dialectal regions of Scotland. So central is the largest, southern around the borders, and remember, this is where a huge amount of people left to come to Ulster from the early 17th century in the plantation. And then we see northern, sort of between Dundee and Aberdeen, if you like, northeastern, and then the insular. And apologies to anybody from Orkney and Shetland, or particular Shetland. I believe Shetland shouldn't be put in a box now. It should be given its rightful place out in the North Sea. However, if we look across the Seach here to Ulster, you can see these three areas detailed. This is going on research carried out by Professor Robert Gregg from Larne in the mid-20th century, and he was really the first person to carry out research, academic linguistic research into Ulster Scots. He went out and met native speakers. He charted the frequency of the language they used and tried to chart it on a map. So he identified these three areas as being the heartlands of Ulster Scots speech here in Ulster. So you have large swathes of County Antrim, North Londonderry. You have parts of sort of around an arc of Strangford Lough, if you like, so the Ards Peninsula and inland on the other side of the lough. probably as far down as maybe Killalay and more inland. And then you have East Donegal, what's known as the Lagan area, really from the River Foyle across the Finn Valley to the far side of Lough Swilly and Letterkenny. And those areas on that map are areas of intense Scots settlement dating back to the plantation of Ulster, and they retained a large amount of Ulster Scots speech. Unfortunately, if that map was redrawn today, it would probably be much smaller, just due to modern inventions of the internet and satellite television and telecommunications, that the transmission of minority language maybe isn't as strong as what it once was a generation ago. Some recommended reading if you want to learn more about Ulster Scots, and indeed you'll probably have to, because you'll not learn enough from my humble talk tonight. I would point you to the Hamely Tongue, James Finton's sort of magnum opus, if you like, first published in 1995, and it's a personal record of Ulster Scots in County Antrim. It's essentially a dialect dictionary of Ulster Scots phrases from his time. He's from the townland of Ballinalub, which is outside Cloughmills, between Ballymoney and Ballymena. And it really is an in-depth study of local words and phrases, and it can cross-reference with various other linguistic traditions and dictionaries, and lots of references. Really, really good. And Jim Finton is a fine poet in his own right as well. I would point you towards Philip Robinson's Ulster Scots Grammar, and there's probably a newer edition of this than the one I have pictured. And if you're interested in syntax and verb tables and prepositions and a system of grammar, that is the book for you. I am not a linguist, but those who are may find that absolutely fascinating. The Concise Ulster Dictionary is a wonderful volume of Ulster words and phrases. A lot of it is from the Ulster Scots language, dialect, whatever you want to call it. A lot of it is from the Gaelic Irish tradition, and some are from other places that you may not think of, like sort of colloquial regional English expressions from Devon and Cornwall and the West Country that pop up in our Ulster speech. There's a romantic notion that the sort of northern Hiberno English that is used here in this province is the closest on these islands to the language of Shakespeare. I'm not so sure, but it does retain an awful lot of sort of older and historical references that have died out in other parts of Great Britain and Ireland. The Concise Scots Dictionary is a huge tome that's always being updated with modern terms, and there is a lot. It's nice that Ulster is referenced in there as a source for a lot of the Scots words that appear in that. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to do a very short bit on the Ulster Scots literary canon, and there's no finer place to start than John Hewitt's book, The Rhyming Weavers, and other country poets of Antrim and Down. So, Ulster Scots words. What's the crack? Any crack with you? Crack is synonymous with Northern Ireland. Banter, fun, news, chat, conversation, can be a joke, story. You often see it spelt C-R-A-I-C, and indeed there is a whole tourism industry based along the Irish crack. It's not an Irish word. It first appears spelt like this in Irish literature and Irish language, believe it or not, in the 20th century. Did they invent it? No, it's borrowed in from Ulster Scots. It's a Northern English and Scots word meaning those things: talk, gossip, news, chat, conversation. And it's so prevalent here in Ulster that it became absorbed into everyday speech, into everyday English, and it even has been absorbed into Irish. Billy Kye, the famous Scots language commentator and broadcaster, comments that it was really the boom in the Irish pub across the world from the 1950s that spread this idea of Irish crack and hospitality across the world, and that sort of strengthened its adoption and this misconception that it is indeed an Irish word, but it's not. It's one that has cross-pollinated from Ulster Scots. one that we all use. We're going for a wee dander, a leisurely walk or stroll. It says here late 16th century Scots. That's whenever we find, according to the Concise Scots Dictionary and other volumes, that's when we find references to it in Scots' original primary sources. The origin of the word is unknown, so we're not quite sure if it's of Norse, Old English, Norman French, etc. But it's a word that is very, very common here in Ulster. The next one, cope or cope, just depending on where you are in the province. I'm from Mid-Antrim. We say cope, meaning to tip over, overturn, empty by overturning. It can also be used as a noun for a rubbish dump. This place is an absolute cope. We need to get it tidied up. And in North Antrim, you might hear someone describe who falls over doing a cope carley, a somersault or a forward tumble. And cope or cope is from the Old French couper, to strike, and you may be familiar with the term coup d'etat, blow of state, or the overthrow of a regime, and you think overthrow, overturn, cope. This is one that often goes under the radar, we. The word we here in Ulster is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It is used in every other sentence, often for no other reason than it's become a habit. Small, little, there's other words like toty are of Scots origin as well. An old Scots word, and it can also be used in some areas in real Ulster Scots heartland speech as a unit of time. How long are we? A small measurement, a little minute or a second. We also see it contracted into weein, and if you think of weein for a small child, again, that's a very, very common term right across the province. Do you want a wee drop of tea? The Northern Ireland national football team is known as our wee country. You can't go to the shop without the assistant asking you, do you want a wee bag for your grocery? And of course, not that I would ever partake, the wee still is a colloquial expression for potching moonshine, illicit home-brewed liquor. Blether. You may argue I'm doing plenty of blethering at you this evening. To talk nonsense, to talk indiscreetly, talk indistinctly. And that's from the Old Norse blathra. So a Viking word essentially that made its way into Scots. We saw from the little animation that a lot of Scots has been influenced by Danish, Norse, Scandinavian, if you like. We often forget that the kings of Norway laid claim to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland for many centuries, and we couldn't. The Vikings get a bad press as being rapers and pillagers and everything else, but they were great farmers, settlers, traders, and they left their mark on the Scots language. Your man's Nathan but a blether. Hark up the blethers of the one politician. Say no more. Gulder, to shout angrily, speak boisterously, to let us a loud shout. Often in Ulster Scots, you hear it with the phrase, gie a gulder, to give a shout. I'm going to gie a gulder when I'm ready for my dinner. The teacher had a sore throat from guldering at the children all day long, and it's believed it's from the Scots word guller, and we think that's an onomatopoeic word. It sounds like what it describes. Hoke, again, a very universal one across Ulster, to hollow out, dig, uproot, root around, rummage. And from the 16th century, it's found in Scots as hauk, and it's related to the Middle Low German holken, to hollow out. And I'll have to hook in the drawer for the spare set of keys, or someone who is always about the refuse receptacle can be known as a bin hooker. This is quite a controversial one. It wasn't that long ago that our health minister, Minister Swan, said he was absolutely scunnered with the situation surrounding COVID-19, as are we all. But there was a debate arose in the media, and of course the media is largely Belfast-based, that they misunderstood what he said, because in the Greater Belfast area, Scondard means embarrassed. However, for most of the rest of the province, scunner or sconder means fed up, irritated, to feel disgust, loathing, nausea, distaste or dislike. And again, we're not quite sure of the etymology of this word, its origins, but it dates back to its use in Scots back to the 1300s. So I'm not quite sure how it has grew up this new meaning in Greater Belfast for meaning embarrassed. It's really in the last part of the 20th century, but my last teaching post was on a little primary school between the Crumlin and Shankill Roads, and that was one word that the children used, meaning embarrassed, or to take, to redden the cheeks, to blush. Haha, Scondard. And that stuck with me because that was a usage that I didn't know growing up in Mid-Antrim. Fiddler. To potter, fiddle around with, fidget, work in a clumsy way. Or someone can be a fiddler, a useless, awkward person. It can also be adapted into an adjective. Something that is very small can be fiddlery, complicated, difficult to work with. And it's probably of Old French, Norman French, or even Latin origins. I'm not going to dwell on the etymology of that because it's quite rude, the connotation that it springs from. I'm sure you can use your imagination. Stop fiddling with the settings on the television, and it's while fittery changing the bulbs in my car's headlights. Here's another one that's used right across our part of the world. Red up, or to red out, the act of clearing away or tidying up, putting in order. Or you can use it to a verb, to clear out, to tidy up. You can give someone a core redding up. You let them know their faults. You give them their pedigree. You give them a scolding. And in rural areas, the redding up has become a universal term for routine farming chores, such as milking, feeding, and the mucking out. It's found in Scots literature back to the 1400s, and it's probably a hybrid of the Old English redden and redden and Middle Low German and Middle Dutch redden, meaning a clearing, a putting in order. Thran. I think this is a uniquely Ulster characteristic, and it's a word that I think we have adopted and use more in our everyday speech in some areas than the Scots do. It means twisted, obstinate, stubborn, or contrary. And from the 14th century Scots word thra, or thra, to twist or turn. And someone could be described as being as thran as a dike, as stubborn as a wall of earth and stone. And thranness is that propensity for stubbornness or obstinacy. Stop and thran and do your homework, you might say to the weans. Some other common phrases you might hear popping up in everyday speech here. I need to get my head showered. For years I thought this phrase was, I need to get my head showered, as in to wash it, wash away all those confusing thoughts. But it's not. It's actually the Scots word shired, meaning to clear. And it really is a reference to a cloudy liquid. If you leave it for long enough, it will settle. So I need to get my head showered. You need to get your head settled to allow your thoughts to clear. I've been up since the screich at dawn, and screich is the Scots word for screech, a loud noise. In this instance, it refers to the dawn bird song, and really the cry of the rooster or the cockerel. And it features that great characteristic of Scots language, the non-verbal velar fricative, I think it's called. Apologies any linguists who are listening who want to contradict me, but as far as I know, that's the name given to the sound that you find in many Scots words that would have English GH sounds. So light, night, sight becomes licht, nicht, sicht, ticht, etc. Those are brobrach, moonlach, nicht, the nicht. So screich at dawn. That characteristic is also interesting in that some of our place names here in Ulster, depending on background and location, Marafelt can be Machrafelt. Donacloney can be Donacloney, Marilyn, Machralyn. And often I remember doing a presentation in Machrafelt High School and having the whole first year there in the assembly hall, and I asked, stand up if you pronounce it Machrafelt, and half the school stood up and the other half remained seated because they referred to it as Marafelt. And the utter sense of distrust that they treated each other with. Why do they say it different? It's only a view or my personal opinion. I think it's possibly to do with the Scots influence on certain different areas that GH sound has been retained. I live not too far away from the village of Duch in County Antrim, but the amount of natives of Duch now who call it Duch and the Duch Road who can't get that sound because it's not part of the area where they come from. It's not part of their linguistic heritage, if you like. Moving on, I'm up to the oxters and housework. Oxters for armpits. a Germanic term. I believe there's something, a very similar term in modern Dutch. As lazy as shach water, there's that sound again, shach water. And shach is a name, Scots name for a ditch, not a flowing river or a burn, but usually stagnant water. But it has come to be used for any body of water, and often people talk about going out of the shach to Scotland, or I've even heard it used to describe the Atlantic to go to America. It would founder ye the day. Founder, of course, is an English word for shipwreck. But in Ulster Scots, when we say we're foundered, we're saying we're cold, we're perishing with the cold. Founder's one of those maybe false friends that appear in Ulster Scots. There's a few other ones like brave. It's a brave day, the day. I'm not saying it's courageous. I'm saying it's a fine day. Another one is big. Your man's brave and big with one boy across the road. We're not saying together they're physically huge. They are in cahoots. They are on very good terms together. And that happens quite a lot in Ulster Scots, that a standard English word has a completely different meaning in Ulster Scots. I got a queer gunk the other day. Queer, of course, is Hiberno English for queer, but it not meaning anything derogatory or homosexual. It means out of the ordinary, exceptional. So it's an exception. I got an exceptional gunk, a shock the other day. And of course, howyer wheest. Wheest is the Scots word for sh, and again, onomatopoeic. It sounds like what it does on the tin. Some other general vocabulary. Somebody could be greeting, they could be weeping or crying. The word skite, when the road got resurfaced, the chippings were skiting off the windscreen, deflecting, sliding. Some of the politicians would give the book, talking about COVID restrictions. Book, of course, is a Scots word for vomit. Whenever I was a child, my mother often gave me a good skelp, and I did deserve it. But skelp, word for a slap or smack, a Scots word. The word thole, there's the old maxim, old age and poverty are ill to thole, or hard to put up with, hard to tolerate, to endure, is a Scots word derived from a very old English source, Tholian. The weather could be described as dreich, miserable, dreary. Somebody could be crabbit in their nature, angry, and even worse, they could be carnaptious, bad-tempered, prone to fits of rage. Someone could be bluttered, they could be inebriated, and again that has a Norse root, but it can also be used to describe tired. And if you think of the Norse, the Vikings, if somebody is concussed around the head, they're dwibbling around the place, they show the same characteristics as if they are inebriated. So concussion and drunkenness, they're bluttered. An Ulster one, we like our soda farls and our tatey breed farls or fadge farls. A farl is from an old Scots word, fardel, meaning literally 1/4 piece. Prach, an Ulster Scots word for miscellaneous bits and bobs, bric-a-brac. What was the weather like last night? That was teeming, overflowing, overpouring, Scots word. I went for a downer up the Lonan. In Belfast, we have the Donegal Pass, and it used to be known as the Pass Lonan or the Pass Lane. My garden is pure clabber or glar at the minute, mud with all the rain. And if you ask someone to hunker down or get down in their hunkers, you're asking them to squat, and that comes from a Scots term, hunker. And of course, we find Scots words in our place names, Burns, Braes, and Nows, and you find these spread across Belfast and wider Ulster. We're very good at insults in Ulster Scots. Here's a few that you may know. Hallion, Scots word for a rascal. A gape, a Scots word for a fool. You can act the gape, act the clown. A dunderhead, again, a fool. A packle, someone who is unskilled or particularly clumsy. A gulpin, again, somebody who's empty-headed, comes from the French word galopin, literally meaning an errand boy. So that's all you're good for. I suppose it's not unlike the Geordie northeast word macam. You're describing somebody as a lackey, a good-for-nothing simpleton. Someone can also be a galoot for a fool. And of course, the great word ganch, Scots word ganch, somebody's ganching or somebody's nothing but a ganch, meaning they talk non-stop, or they're quite insulting in their speech. Then, of course, numpty is a more modern Scots word, but it still doesn't mean we can't use it here in Ulster, and it is used for somebody that's empty-headed. I want to look very, very briefly at the Ulster Scots literary tradition. We have a real rich Ulster Scots literary heritage going back to the time of Robert Burns and before. And I want to open with this little verse. I'm sure you've heard it before in other presentations, by Hugh Porter, who was the Bard of Monaslein, sort of outside Rathfriland. He was one of John Hewitt's rhyming weaver poets. And thirdly, in the style appears the accent o' my early years, which is nor Scotch nor English either, but part of baith mixed up together. Yet it's the sort my neighbours use, wha think shoon prettier for their shoes. And I think that encapsulates Ulster Scots. It is colourful, it is descriptive, and I think we really see the best of it in poetry and in literature. I'm going to do a few little excerpts from some of our Ulster Scots poets. But first of all, I want to read you the dedication of the Rhyming Weavers by John Hewitt. And the dedication is to Brendan Adams, Honorary Archivist of the Ulster Folk Museum. But it really talks about these Ulster Scots poets. Many of them were home weavers at the time when linen was the real currency of economic prosperity here in Ulster. None in our day has, to such sure effect, defined the textures of our tangled speech, from Barney and Burra drawing each well-hanselled thread, that we may learn respect for the rich colours of each dialect. This, given ready usage, yet might teach our tense minds to unclench and open reach across the gap that sunders sect from sect. So take this tapestry of prose and rhyme. The prose is mostly mine, the rhymes belong to weaver, ploughman, blacksmith from that time, before the schoolhouse tamed their lively tongue, when spinning wheel and loom were at their prime, and every townland earned its name in song. And I think that little verse there, before the schoolhouse tamed their lively tongue, most of these Ulster Scots rhyming weaver poets didn't receive much formal education, a bit like Robbie Burns himself, who of course is central to the Linen Hall Library. The Gibson collection is housed there, one of the largest collection of Burnsiana in the world, and of course you see the little bronze statue of Robbie Burns at the top of the staircase on your left hand side before you go into the cafe. So I'm going to start with a poem by the man described as Ulster's Burns, James Orr. James Orr was a weaver. He was a radical, if you like, with a small r. He was a United Irishman. He, fearing arrest for the small role he played in the turnout of 1798, he afterwards fled to America, like so many did, as an exile. But unusually for Ulster Scots, James Orr came home again. He didn't like it, possibly because people couldn't understand his language. The grass was greener at home. I don't know, but I want to give you a little bit of a few stanzas of his poem To the Potato. And James Orr died in 1816. So I think this is very poignant, this poem, this dedication to the potato. My country's stay, he says in it, and it's sort of before the potato famine. It's prescient that he's able to write about this and see the dependence of his community to it, to the potato. Some of the words and phrases may be quite archaic, but I'll do my best with it here. A ledge would find the fairly quatta, the weed we smoke and chow the fatta. I would nae grudge the want to water, wealth, waste and tea, but leaves me on the precious prato, my country's stay. Brach blooms the bean that sunts the valley, and brach the pea that spills the sally, and brach the plum tree blossom brawly, and blue bout lant. but what we strich raise ros can tally, that sunbeams tint. Way worth the proud prolactic pack, wha point and pritters dunny tack, wi' them galore and whiles a plack to make me frisky, I'll find and barley freely lack, except in whisky. What would perdils and bogs and braes, for dear cottacks nae meal can raise, wha ne'er taste butter, beef, nor cheese, nor put new clays on, while they make can hardly please some rack-rent mason. What would they do without dough blacks, type of potato? Their wains wi' circless whames to rack, they boost to forage like the fox that nichly plunners, or way the squires turn out in bucks and hungry hunters. Sweet in the morning after dashling, lie dicht as powdered ower wi' mashling. Creased scones stand pilt and plates are bristling round the angle, while a fond wifey fast as fistling and teacups jingle. Sweet to the buns that blithely enter at dinner time, they graze in centre, chumped up wi' kale that pay the planter, beans, parsnips, peas. Gosh, could a cautious covenanter wait for the grace? And it goes on eulogising the potato and what a wonderful crop it is. It's easy to grow. It's not that nutritious, but it provided such a large part of the local diet at that time. Another one of Hewitt's rhyming weavers is Sam Thompson, who, although technically wasn't a weaver, he was a sort of hedge school master. He was a correspondent of Rabbie Burns. He visited Burns, I think it was in 1793 or 1794, a few years before Burns' death. Apologies if I've got the date wrong. But Thompson was known as the Bard of Carngranny, which is a small town land between Temple Pottery and Mollusk today. I particularly like Sam Thompson's poetry. He wasn't that far away from where I was reared and where I live, but he spent much of his youth in a place called Glenquorry, which is just up the road from me, and I went to school with people from Glenquorry, and it's still a very dense Ulster Scots speaking area. And I'm going to give you there's three verses to this. It's called The Hawk and the Weasel. So an awful lot of the Ulster Scots poetry focuses on nature and the natural world and everyday surroundings. So a few words in this is whitthrit, which is actually the Scots name for a stoat white rat rather than a weasel. And another word in this is gled, a Scots word for a hawk. Hopefully you can get the rest of it. The Hawk and Weasel. To tune nae morn as Lizzie haid to sell a pickle yarn, a wandering whitthrit she espied, a sporting at a cairn. Along the heath beskirted green that played wi' mony a wheel, she stood and dicht at baith her een, and thought it was the deil she saw at freaks. But soon her doubts were a' dismissed, a gled came whistling by, and seized the weasel ere it wist 'twas halfway in the sky. But soon the ghost grew feeble-like, and syne began to fa', till doon he did it on a dyke, his thrapple, 8 and twa. Let him snuff that. The weasel off in triumph walks, and left the bloodless glutton, a warning sad to future hawks that green for weasels' mutton. So reprobates that spiteful cross decree their neighbours' ruin, are often forced, like foolish goss, to drink o' their ain brewing, whilst as it's wrong. So I love this notion of taking this scene of nature, this hawk, or I think it was before the buzzard, or it could be an eagle of some sort, or a goshawk, or sparrowhawk, or peregrine falcon, whatever it may be, catching this stoat and thinking it's got a meal, but the whitthrit, the stoat, cutting its throat out, and that comparison to the reprobate, to the sinner, making light of their neighbours' beliefs, and you could say that they both share the same fate. I'm going to move from the rhyming weavers now and give you a little taste of poetry from the tail end of the Victorian age. And this is a little piece, and it's in a little book I have. It's called Bob McKean, The Wit and Wisdom of an Ulster Scot. And Bob McKean was a fictional character. It was really a pseudonym used by John Weir, the proprietor of the Ballymena Observer, from about the late 1880s right through to the early 1900s. And whenever he died, his son, William, took over the mantle of writing this weekly column as Bob McKean. This was in vogue at the time. W.G. Little did the same in some North Down papers, and it showed there was an appetite for writing in the vernacular in the local press. And it said that many people just bought the Ballymena Observer to see what Bob McKean was going to say this week, because it was quite clever. They used it as a device to read up a lot of the chat and scandal and gossip in the town. And because there wasn't a real person putting their name to it, they could get away with saying things that were maybe quite controversial. So this little poem is called Willie Archer's Pledge. And I suppose at the tail end of the 1800s, after the 1859 revival, there was quite a boom in the abstinence movement, and people taking abstinence oaths and pledges down at the courthouse. So this is called Willie Archer's Pledge, and there's a wee paragraph at the start before this poem. I'm just reading about these men that's taking pledges every week at the court to break them the next year, and I think if it was my case, afore I would dare, I would make up my mind to take the punishment like a man or gie up the drink altogether. This is one side of it. And on the other hand, if a man can only be kept sober even for a week or twa, maybe it's worthwhile letting him pledge away and keep off it as long as he can. There's few I doubt that it makes any permanent improvement on. The only one that I ever kent o was Willie Archer, and he kept it, as I'm just going to tell you now. Willie Archer got a drink yon Saturday in town, and far mair till he was fou and bluttered in the crun. He tried to make his way out hame, and thocht him no amiss, but his legs they wouldn't carry him, so he dwibled hame like this. Across the road and back and forth he dottered on his way, sometimes his length across the dyke till nae could get by. At length no further could he go, and aye the pad would kiss, till he doubled up across the road and just lay down like this. Up come a policeman on his bait, just looking out for trade, when he hears in front a fearful noise, the snorting Willie made. He lifts the victim by the neck. What matter? What is this? But the policeman never let him go till he ran him in like this. Frae that day on, Willie took the pledge. He thocht sae much disgrace to be afore the magistrates or any sicker place. He's new as steady as a rock, along his cause to bliss, the nicht that he was overcome and made him strecht as this. And Willie swears by all that's blue, if he took drink again, he'd never stop till he was fou, sae enticing as the grain. And that's why he's a strict TT, and a glass he'd never kiss. For if once I touched a drop, quo he, I just slide back down like this. I enjoy those sorts of local folk poetry, and it shows you the vocabulary that the local people understood, comprehended, used, were passionate about even then. And in conclusion, in this little introduction to Ulster Scots, some of the poetry is quite dense, maybe not familiar with all the words and phrases in it. And again, if you're not, look up the Hamely Tongue, look up the Concise Ulster Dictionary, you find references to them there. And again, the Lynn Hall Library has a fantastic Ulster Scots section where you can reference all these books if you don't own them, hopefully when normality returns, and I'm sure you'll be able to look them up and see. I hope you have enjoyed my wee talk today. If you want to learn any more, the Discover Ulster Scots Centre is on 1 to 9 Victoria Street in the Cathedral Quarter, just along from the Albert Clock, heading towards the Cathedral, end of town. In normal times, we're open from 10 to 4 every weekday, and I'd be more than glad to see and have a wee yarn, a clog with you if you ever come this road. Thanks very much. Take care.